Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Westerville Public Library program for container gardening today. With us, we have Cindy Maravich from Inniswood, who is the crazy plant lady, according to her shirt, and her niece. And we are very glad to have you. So thank you very much.
All right, Jessica, I'm so happy to be here. If you come to any of my programs before at Inniswood, you may have heard me say some of the same things I might say today. I have been teaching about how to grow things in containers at Inniswood for 13 years. So for a long time, I've been talking about this subject, and I'm very excited about it because I think we, at the beginning of the season, like where we are now, we're so excited about getting stuff in the ground and planting, and it's Mother's Day tomorrow and everything's like hurry, hurry. And then we wonder what happens by June and July and why our plants aren't looking so great. And I always think it's because we rush too quick to put everything in. So today's program is really about kind of basic stuff. We're going to talk about the types of pots and containers, what it is you're going to be planting and where you're going to put those containers. I'm going to talk about what's in that soil mix and what those ingredients mean for your soil. We'll touch briefly on fertilizers, but just kind of some overall basic things that I have learned over the years that I think are very valuable and useful, whether you've never grown anything in a container or if it's something you've been doing for decades. I feel like some of the things that I have learned over the years, I just feel like we should share. So yes, my name is Cindy, and I am the Senior Environmental Educator at Inniswood here in Westerville, Ohio. And so that means I get to do a lot of education programs that relate back to our gardens, which include things like growing things in containers. And fun fact before we get started, the Inniswood containers on the grounds are going to be planted this week. So hopefully soon in the next few weeks, you'll see them out on the ground. So wanted to give you guys a heads up about that so you can come visit and look at them. How are we going to start building our best container? I'm going to toggle back and forth between some things to look at on the screen, which is information, and then just looking at me. So, but I want to demonstrate a few things today. Most of my program usually is demonstrating how to do things. So bear with me. Hopefully you'll get a good view of what I'm doing. So as I mentioned, one of the first things we think about when we think about containers, and likely you can see it on my screen, are, well, I really want to have like the really pretty containers that are like bright red or super tall or super exciting looking, right? And we have those at Inniswood, and you can have them at your home too, but they're made out of different materials. So whether they're tall, short, in the shade, in the sun, knowing what that container is made out of is actually pretty important. And one of the things I always think about is porosity. So porosity is this idea of, like our skin has pores, porosity is things that can move in and out of it, right? So whether water and air can move in and out of, in this case, mostly the sides of that container. So the most non-porous, or things that no air or water is going to penetrate, glazed pots, things that have been painted, plastic pots, nothing's getting through the sides of the plastic pots. Metal or glass pots are things that aren't going to let moisture or air in and out of. Now that could be a really good thing, or it can be something that could be problematic for you. So it's just something to consider when you start thinking about what it is you're going to grow and where those containers are going to be located. In the middle are the semi-porous things, so things like wooden containers, or if you've got hanging baskets, that fibrous, that pressed fiber that goes on the inside of a hanging basket, those are what we consider kind of semi-porous. So water and air can move through there, but not as easily and quickly as a terracotta pot. Now, terracotta pots are one of my most favorites because they're just this classic container, right? Now, this is much more heavy than its look-alike made out of plastic, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But our terracotta pots are basically, it's a clay pot that's not been glazed, so it doesn't have a coating on it. And these are extremely porous pots, which means that water and air move very quickly through the sides of this pot. Not something we always think about, But it is something to remember if you choose to use these kinds of pots, because one of the things I like to remind people to do if you grow things in in terracotta pots, you want to make sure that all those pores are sealed off before you put your soil in there. So I always tell people to either hose them off or sink them in water so those pores are nice and tightly closed, because then if you fill it with soil, any water that's in your soil is going to immediately be pulled out of the side of the container should you go with your terracotta pots. So just something to consider. Now, there's lots of different options for choosing the type of container. As I mentioned, most of the time, people are going to choose between either a terracotta pot or a plastic pot. So as I mentioned, terracotta, air and moisture penetrate the sides of the pot. Now, the downside of this could be when you use a terracotta pot, air and water can wick away out of the sides of that container quicker than it would a plastic pot, because that plastic container is not porous, right? So for example, you're going to grow something in a plastic pot and you're going to water it. It's going to take a little bit longer for any excess water to evaporate and leave that container. But if you use the terracotta pot, it's going to evaporate and leave that container quicker. So it might result in more frequent waterings. Then again, it might be nice if you have these in a place where you know that whatever you're growing is not going to need that much water, or maybe it's in a shadier spot, in which case it wouldn't really affect you. These are not freeze resistant, and anybody who's left them outside, whether on purpose or accidentally, may then at this time of year go out and find them all broken. Don't throw them away. They become great toad abodes. So if you have pieces or chunks of terracotta pots, keep them. You can put water in them if you flip them upside down. You could be a little reservoir for different types of amphibians. But I like the toad abode idea because it gives little hiding places, and you can easily just like stick pieces of clay throughout your garden beds, and they could easily hide, and it gives a little bit of a refuge and habitat for some of those other critters that might be in your garden. But they don't handle the freeze well. As opposed to if you leave a bunch of plastic pots out the side of your house or even in your garage that gets too cold, they're not going to break. In fact, they're freeze resistant, and they're not really something that you have to worry too much about unless you drive over them. You could like bang it on the wall. I have a small child, he can throw these things. I mean, obviously not when there's plants in there, but these are much more sturdy and reliable. So if you're in a situation where you're like, man, I can't be worrying about these like pots that could break at any time, you can get yourself a plastic pot. They make a lot that look just like terracotta, and that's another pro for the plastic, right? These are the pots you can find that are bright red or purple or have cool designs on them, because they usually can be fabricated to look like whatever we want them to look like. So they come in a variety of shapes and sizes and colors, whereas your terracotta pots are going to be pretty standard, this nice tan color. So again, go to the aesthetics of what you're looking for as well. Now, the other thing with terracotta, this is a relatively small terracotta pot, but it has some weight to it. So if you're thinking of putting some big pots next to your front door or in an area that, you're thinking, gosh, I really want to go big this year and have a big pot with some big showy flowers and plants in them, this might not be the best if you have trouble moving them around. Because the idea behind growing stuff in containers is that they're movable, that you can like move them from place to place, and they don't always have to be in that same garden bed, right? But if you choose pots that are heavy to begin with, and then you fill them with soil, and then you grow plants in them, you're not going to be able to move them yourself, and that's going to be kind of annoying. I mean, at least it would be for me. Then again, if you never want to move the pots, that's fine, but it's something to consider, because even this pot has got some weight to it. So if I get any bigger of a container that's terracotta, it's going to be heavy, and I'm going to have to use some sort of dolly or, muscles from other people to move it. So things to consider, because typically the majority of folks who are growing stuff in containers are either going to choose the terracotta or the plastic. So there are some specific differences to using them. Now, the other thing I want to mention, because I usually forget to, notice that there is a big hole on the bottom of this container, and that's for drainage. Drainage is very important. Now, they sell these things with these really cute saucers that sit underneath, And those are great if you have a, an actual house plant in them, and you don't want any of that extra water drainage to, disrupt or bother your carpet or tile in your house. Those are great. But outside, if you got your containers outside, you want to have a space for this excess water to go. So that drainage is important. And I tell people this because you want to grow in this nice plastic pot, which is super funky, right? Like, look at this orange pot. Super great. It comes with this nice saucer on the bottom. When you get these, immediately take that saucer off. See how you have the holes now? Those drainage holes are really important. If your plants sit in water for too long, they're not going to do real well because they're going to have too much water, even if it's a water-loving container, right? So the drainage holes are really important. But again, don't throw these away. These have good purposes. I like to actually start little seeds in them. They're great for growing microgreens inside your house. You can use them as mortota boats. You can put a little water in them and have them as a water dish for those other critters. So don't just toss it, but know that if you're going to put this guy outside, it needs to have somewhere for that extra water to go. All right. Now, typically, when we start growing stuff, you choose your container, right? We've chosen our container. I'm a plastic pot all the way. I love terracotta, whatever it is you choose. And you've got maybe one from last year, or you bought a cute one, or maybe someone gifts you one tomorrow. Hint, hint to anybody who still needs gifts for their moms. Maybe you want to, you're ready to get started. So now what do I put in there? And there are, and I love this word, a plethora of soilless mixes, which means that they are bagged mixes that have different ingredients in them that can be very helpful to whatever you're growing. And there are many that are excellent. And so I want to be clear and tell people that if you like a certain mix, if there's a certain Miracle Grow or a mix you've had for a long time and you really like it, that's totally fine. But I'm going to talk you through what's in there, how to store that mix so you can use it year after year if you need to. And then also, if you want to make your own mix, which I like to do, we're going to talk about how to do that too. So first things first, here's my first tip. Let's say you've got a beautiful shirt that your niece gifted you, and you're coming in the house and you really want to quick water something, or you've got to do some maintenance on your containers. I recommend delegating an apron for gardening. Now I have a lot of aprons. I do cook as well, but I keep some just for my container gardening. Because one, I don't want to mess up my cool shirt today. But two, let's say you're coming home from church or an activity where you're looking pretty nice, but you just want a quick workout there. So put your apron on. It really then, if you've got one with pockets, put your phone in there and stuff. But I also recommend wearing gloves. Now, don't be a hero and think you don't need gloves. I mean, one, you want to keep your hands clean, because what if your phone rings and then you got to fumble around trying to answer your phone, your hands are all messy and you're wiping them on your apron and then you got to wash your apron. It's a whole big thing. So what you want to do is have some gloves. You probably already have some if you're interested in gardening, but I would recommend using them, because here's the thing. Even if you use a bagged mix, most, if not all bag mixes have at least a trace amount of a synthetic fertilizer in them. It's one of the reasons why I don't really care to use them, because I have young kids and my young children help me to put my containers together. And my youngest son actually still is young enough that he might actually eat some of that. And I don't want him to ingest any. Not that it's bad or wrong, just my choices. I really want to start with no fertilizer, and then I get to kind of control the fertilizer for that pot and container as it grows. So I have, for example, here's a nice bag mix. This bag mix has, it's Nature's Care. It's a product of Miracle Grow. It's touted as organic and natural. It's light and fluffy. It's a great mix. Again, if it's a mix that you like, that you know you've been using for a while, feel free to use it. But know that it's important to read on the back what's in it. So here's a couple things to note. It will tell you what's in it. Just like if you were to buy any other food product, it will tell you what the ingredients are. For example, the ingredients in this one are sphagnum peat moss, processed forest products, core, perlite, organic fertilizer, and yucca. I don't know what yucca. I mean, I know it's a plant, but I'm not sure what phase this is. So that's kind of cool, right? Let's say you buy this, you open it up, you think it's fantastic. You know what? I'm going to stick with this mix. Great. Bear with me, because even if you just use this mix and don't make your own, there's still great ways to make sure that you can continue to use this mix. There we go. Now, smart women many years ago, smarter than me, did some work, and they figured out how much soil you're typically going to need per the amount and size of container you're going to use. Because I don't know about you, but if you've ever gotten yourself in this situation where you're super pumped up, you see a sale, you go to the store and you buy a bunch of bag to mix and you got containers, and either you run out of containers before you run out of mix, or more likely you run out of soil mix before you finish all your containers. And now you got to take your apron off and your gloves and you got to go back to the store and get some more, right? So I found this work that was done many years ago. It's still relatively helpful. And so I like to show it to people, because before you go to the store, you might want to take a look at what containers you're planting. Maybe you got a whole fleet, you're like growing 14, 15 different containers, but maybe you're just starting with 1 or 2. Do you really need 2 or 3 bags? Well, you just got to do some simple math. So let's say I'm only going to start with just this one container. This container has a certain size, and typically they're in inches. And the way to know how big your container is to measure the diameter of the top of your container. So this one measures right at 8 inches. This is an 8-inch pot. So for an 8-inch pot, you need about 1.5 gallons of soil. So for example, if I'm going to use this soil mix, on the front it tells me that this contains 8 dry quarts of soil mix. And we should know, and if you don't, just Google it, that typically 4 quarts equals 1 gallon, right? So I might need this bag for this container. Hopefully that makes sense. It's not, exact science, but I think it's a really good starting point, because I feel like we always tend to need more soil than we actually think we do. And that's because we add moisture to it and do some other things. It breaks down, we've got plant roots in there. So just something to consider as you're moving forward and purchasing some supplies. Now, as we get moving into what to do with this stuff, here's a tip. Get yourself a nice plastic container to hold your soil mix. This is a great size container. It has a nice lid that clips on. This is what I use because if I went any larger, it would be too heavy to carry and hard to mix in. And with a nice lid that snaps on and in plastic, I can store leftovers of my soil mix from year to year, even outside, and not worry about it busting open. Because if you maybe went back to your garage or an area next to your house and you had some of this mix that you did one of these, clipped it, right? And you were like, oh, I can use that next year. And then you opened it and it's like orange or weird inside. It's probably because some moisture got in there, right? But if you were to store it in your container with a nice lid, then you can keep it from year to year. It's less likely to, I don't know if you have like mice or chipmunks that might chew into your bags of stuff. If it's in this container, it's less likely to get affected by that. So I have one at home and I mark all over it like Cindy's container stuff. So my husband doesn't use it. And then I can easily move it around. It's nice too, because if you have little kids, grandkids, you can just stick it on the ground and on their knees, they can help you mix stuff. So I recommend if you use a bag mix, continue to use it and store that bag mix and mix it in their container. And when you mix it in your container, you're going to want to add some water. And I'll do that in a minute. But people always tell me like, it's fine because I've opened up my bag mix and there was already water in there. But really, it's not water, it's condensation, because most of the time these bags are hanging out on big crates outside Home Depot and Lowe's and your garden centers. And so it's just getting wet because the air outside is creating that, right? So it's not actually moist. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So if you use your own mix, great. If not, let's talk about what some of the items are that are in your mix. There we go. All right. So on this slide, it talks about all the different things that are in different types of bag mixes. So the first one, and I read it to you as an ingredient on this bag, was peat moss. Peat moss is super cool, right? Peat moss is light and fluffy. It holds air, or I'm sorry, it holds water. Super helpful for soil profile in your container. But I also have found that there is a better, more renewable alternative, and I'll talk about that. You can purchase peat moss separately, all by itself, and peat moss has really nice, fluffy, dark look to it. It's a great component, and it's in really a majority of plant mix, soilless mixes. So something you can choose. Now, the way we get peat moss is actually it's decomposed remains of sphagnum moss. So the majority of that moss actually comes, it's shipped here from places. It's that really nice layer that's beneath where most mosses live. So a lot of times it's coming from rainforest, wetlands, and it's being pulled out of those spaces where it could still stay. So I found an alternative. Not that peat moss is bad, and if you really like it, feel free to keep using it. But I want to tell you about something else. This mix actually had it. You heard me say core. I, many years ago, came across this lovely seed starting mix. And the seed starting mix looks like a brick. And turns out this is core. So picture how coconuts grow. And when you see them on trees, they have that husk on the outside. So when coconuts are actually harvested, they pull that off and then, have learned that that same material is mostly used as like bedding material for reptiles. So if you've ever housed like a skink or some other kind of reptile in a tank, a lot of times that's the material that's used as bedding. But we also found that it can be used as a soil medium to grow things. Now this one's touted as a seed starting mix, and that's because a lot of times I grow my seeds just with this mix. It literally is, it's a compressed brick, which means there's no water added. It's literally a just add water. So if you're a just add water gal or guy, this is your gig, right? There's ingredients on the back, just add water. And when you do that, it expands to, this is about half, 3/4 of what you're gonna get from this brick. So it gets really big. So this you could buy, store it, it's only a few dollars. And then when you're ready to use it, add water, okay? I use it as an alternative to peat moss because I feel like, one, it's not as expensive, and it's a little bit more of a renewable resource. So it makes me feel better about that too. It holds water, but it's also great for drainage. So it's a really important component. So for me, I usually choose between a peat moss or coconut core if I'm making my own mix. Now, the next two options on there are compost. Compost is important, but I don't think it's vital. So a lot of people purchase compost. Maybe you make your own compost from your garden. You can mix that into your mix, or you can add it as kind of a top dressing after you've got your plants in there. Either way is fine, but if you're also kind of a fertilizer person and you want to add fertilizer, if you've got some already in your bagged mix, I don't know that compost is essential in your container, but it's important, and I thought people might be interested in it. So if you have some at home, or if you are interested in purchasing some, mushroom compost is great if you're not a composter at your house, and it's easily you can find it in retail stores. The last two are vermiculite and perlite, which I'm sure are words that you've heard over the years. Maybe you know what they are, maybe you don't. But vermiculite kind of looks like little flecks of gold. My son loves it because it feels like he's like gold mining. And they look like, if you look at them real close, they look like little accordions, little accordion folds on them. And it's basically, it's a mica-like mineral that's heated in order for it to look like that. It actually holds water pretty well, so it's a nice component to your soil mix. if you're worried about making sure that it's retaining water in that mix. So it's a good component. I usually include it. It's most of the time included in a lot of mixes, but not always. The thing that I would probably say more than not is always included in your soilless bag mixes is perlite. Perlite is the white stuff. It looks like little pieces of popcorn or crushed pieces of, well, basically it is rock that's been mined. And that is really good because it helps promote drainage. So it changes that soil profile. So you've got the fine little mixtures that you're gonna find in the coconut core. You're adding the vermiculite, it's gonna help hold moisture. And then you add these kind of larger irregular chunks and it breaks up that soil so it's not like one thick, same type and shape of different types of soil and soil components in there. So it mixes it up a little bit. Be careful with perlite. Perlite is something that does create a dust, so you want to work with it outside if you can. And if you need to, wear a mask, because the more you work with it and the more you kind of dump it into things, it will create a fine mist, a dust, which a lot of people I have heard are very sensitive to. But good thing we have a lot of masks around. So just keep your mask on if you're working with perlite. But I do think it's an important component. I'm going to forward to the next screen because this is kind of a sample mix that I use. So I'm going to show you what I typically do. I have my trusty container. You can see I've used it for different things, mostly for my soil mix. And I'm going to use equal parts coconut core, perlite, and vermiculite. I don't have any compost because I'm working inside the Innis house right now and I didn't really want it to be too messy. But again, if you use compost, you can mix it in or use it as just a little bit of top dressing on the top of your container. And make sure if you're composting and it's your garden compost that it is in the last stage. So it's very fine and you don't have like chunks of bananas and stuff still in it. That's not going to be good. All right, so I'm not going to use compost for today, but I want to show you how I would mix this. So when I say equal parts, don't worry so much about going to get like some sort of measuring container, because years ago, one of the first times I did this program was about to start and I was going to start mixing stuff and I didn't have what I needed and everybody was waiting for me. And so I ran quick to my coworker's office and I said, do you have like a cup or like a McDonald's cup or something I can use? And she gave me many types of mixing. It's a Dickey's barbecue pit cup. She quickly realized after I used it that she didn't want it back. So I have had it for this entire time, for many years, and it's worked great. So if you got an old barbecue pit cup or McDonald's cup or just, you know, a trowel even, that works fine. It's not really something to stress too much about. Just know that you really want it to be as equal as possible. And if it can't be, then you want the largest amount of ingredient to be the coconut core. So I'm going to take some coconut core just to show you. I got 1 scoop of my barbecue cup of coconut core. I'm going to do 2 scoops, and then I'm going to continue with 2 scoops for my other 2 ingredients. So first, the perlite. Remember, perlite can create a dust, and you'll likely see that soon. So let me mask up for a second. Put my gloves back on. Show you some perlite. Got a cup's worth of perlite and another cup's worth of perlite. And now I'm going to switch over to vermiculite. I can take this off so you can hear me better. The vermiculite's the one that's got those, looks like little flecks of gold in it. Remember, this is just a sample mix that I do. It doesn't mean you have to do it. It doesn't have to be the exact same components. You could just grow just in the coconut core or with some peat moss. But here's the thing to remember. If you're like many of us, particularly here in Ohio, over the years I've seen, we've actually kept our containers out longer. Our falls are still quite nice. It's still pretty warm in October. So if you think about this, you might be building your container this weekend or this week and even planting your plants in it. And then your plants will stay in that container for June, July, August, September, October, sometimes even into November. So we're talking like half the year now, your plants are going to be growing in this space. So it's really important, like I said at the beginning, to make sure that we're creating a good home for them, because we want them to stay in there and grow and look wonderful for many, many months. So if you were to just start with just a stripped down like peat moss or just a seed starting mix, that might be great and your plants will grow, but they're not necessarily going to thrive unless you give them a little bit more of a mixed up component. Now, I don't think I have the right screen, so I'm still sharing, but I'll try and show you guys. It looks pretty standard, right? We've added 3 different mixes and components. I'll switch back to not share so that you guys can see me a little bit better. And this looks quite pretty, right? Check it out. Now, before I do anything and try to actually utilize this, I'm gonna add some water. So have a hose handy, or in this case, a watering can. And you want to add water until that water or your soil mix in here is moist. So you don't want to have dripping water. If it ends up drippy, just add more soil components. Add some more coconut coir, right? So if you had too much water, add some more coconut coir to sop it up. But what you want to do then is mix it up. And I don't know about you, but I have some people in my life who love this job, who think it's very therapeutic to mix soil. And you feel really kind of like, you know, almost like you're like brewing something cool because you're using your hands to dig some stuff. If you don't like this, you're not really interested, even with your gloves, you can always use a tool like a trowel. But you want to add water and mix it up so it looks as uniform as possible. Now, I didn't mix a whole lot of soil because I think I'm just gonna add it to a fairly small container. So I don't have a whole lot in here. It's really only about a quarter of the container of my soil container that's in here. But notice how different and nice it looks. Now, those little white fluffy things are the perlite. The goldish stuff is the vermiculite. The other medium is that coconut coir. You could use peat moss if you wanted. Again, this is if you're making your own mix, not if you're using another mix. Now, is it ready to put into our container? Yeah, pretty much so, right? Like we've mixed it, got the components, we've added water. I'm gonna take my terracotta pot, and if you were listening, what would I do to this terracotta pot before I add my soil? I would want to make sure that this terracotta pot, those pores are closed. So I'd soak it in some water, I'd hose it down with a hose, depending on where you're working, and make sure that this pot is wet inside and out before you add your soil. So know that that's what you should do should you use terracotta. And then I'm just gonna add some soil. Now, many years ago, I grew a lot of things in greenhouses, and I would tell the people who work for me what not to do. And what not to do is make a muffin pot. Now, everyone knows what a muffin is. They're delightful, calorie-laden desserts or something to eat with coffee. And they tend to look a lot like this. Look at that. Can we plant in this? This is not the correct way. This is a muffin pot, which would only make you hungry if you saw it. What you want to do is scoop off that stuff that's on the top and not just make it level, because that also is incorrect. You've got to make sure that you've got a nice couple-inch lip at the top of your container, because of course that's where we're going to water. So when we add the water to the container, we want a place for the water to sit in, right? So we want it to sit there, so when you water, so there's stuff growing in here, we're gonna water, you're gonna see it flood the top of this. And then you're gonna see that water start to go down the top. And what I like to tell people is flood the top, go water something else or do something else. A few minutes later, come back and flood the top again. That's the best way to water. The water's getting in the soil. The roots are gonna start taking it up. But you're not gonna water the top of the plant or try to fill the base, because remember, these are gonna be outside. So different if you're growing something inside, or if it's smaller. Growing something big like this is how you wanna start it. So make sure there's a space at the top for your water. Now, lots of conversations about what to grow and what size pots, and I do a lot of programs on that. So maybe Jessica and I could come up with a series at some point. But I will tell you that it's important to try not to jam too many things into a pot. It's called a root shoot ratio. So just like most of us are relatively proportioned, our pots and our plants and containers should be as well. So if I look at myself, I have, the middle part of my body is here, and I've got, the top part of my body relatively matches the bottom of my body, right? So if I were a plant in a container, I would put most of from my waist down, those are my roots, and that would be in the container. Because again, I have pretty long legs actually. I want it to be as equal as possible. So think about how big that plant's gonna be, number one, and you wanna make sure you have enough root space that you do to the shoot space. So for this size pot, I mean, honestly, only one plant would fit in here. And this is a nice little, I think it's a 6-inch pot, maybe it's 4. This is a Gumfreena. It's gonna end up in one of our seasonal beds. And so I'm just gonna show you real quick. Another reason why not to put too much into your pot is because you're gonna have to move some of that soil around to put this plant in. I'm just gonna lightly break up this soil. It's not really root bound. It's got some nice healthy white roots. I'm gonna make a little spot and I'm gonna stick my Gumfreena in there. If you wanted, you could tuck some smaller plants in there. But remember, these are not growing in garden beds. So one of the interesting things about growing in containers is that we're stopping these roots from going any bigger, right? So we want to make sure we're giving them the appropriate amount of space for the roots to grow, and not that we are jamming too much in there, because if we put a whole bunch of other plants in here, which people do, and the plants would probably still stay alive, they're not going to grow as robust and vigorous as they would if they were to be in a bigger pot. So if I wanted to add some, things that maybe spill over the edge, or maybe something that fills in this spot around the base of this Gumfreena, then likely I would pick a larger pot, maybe a 12 or 16-inch pot, so everybody in there has space to grow. Now I want to address something. I don't have a large pot because, again, I'm in kind of a modified space here. Most of our containers at Inniswood are very large, so much so that we have to actually move them with skid loaders. So again, remember, they're heavy, you're adding soil to them. And people always ask me, clearly they're not full of soil, right? So I think the background photo on some of my slides show some of the really great containers we have behind the Innis house. Those are very tall containers. And I will tell you that we don't modify them with crushed cans or styrofoam peanuts or water bottles. We don't do that, and here's why. Number one, remember, these plants are going to grow in here for many, many months, right? We want them to grow and thrive and have enough space for those roots to spread out and not get jammed up in there. I know that it might make it not as heavy in your container, that is easier to move around, but unless you're only planning to have those plants in there for a few weeks or a month at a time, what happens is, as those roots begin to grow and spread through that soil profile, they'll stop and jam up, and they'll kind of stunt their growing. So not necessarily die, but they're not going to get much bigger either. And if you add fertilizer, that's just going to kind of stress out the plant, because it's not going to be able to use that fertilizer to then start to really bust open and grow. So hopefully that makes sense. I have also heard from folks who have done the styrofoam peanuts when they're growing in larger pots, and then by the time they take their container apart at the end of the year, they learned that plants that grew in there, those roots actually grew through those styrofoam peanuts. And in her words, she said, there is nothing more tedious than extracting styrofoam peanuts from plant roots. Because her plan was to then use them again for next year, right? But the plant will find a way to keep growing. So try not to do those things, because I think in the end, it's just detrimental to the health of our plants that are growing in those containers. It's just not necessary. So if you're worried about it being too big and not being able to move it, then maybe choose some smaller containers to get started would be my suggestion. Okay, a quick word about fertilizer, and then I think we'll have time for some questions. And I'm going to share the screen again. There's not too much on it, but it's something if you're not really familiar with, to let me move forward. All right, so we did our sample mix. Remember I talked about adding some compost if you've got it. Super fine, but not always necessary. Okay. The next screen is going to talk about fertilizer. And I have some fertilizer to show you. Things that you might have already, things that you might have seen in the store, maybe something you're considering using. So let's talk briefly about the different ways you can see. There we go. Fertilizer. So typically fertilizer, there's a whole bunch of micronutrients that aren't necessarily always labeled, but the macronutrients are the 3 numbers you see on fertilizer. So for example, this one's a liquid fertilizer, and this fertilizer has 3 numbers, 10, 15, 10. Those correspond to nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Very generally speaking, people tend to refer to them as shoot, bloom, and root, because nitrogen is very good for shoot development, phosphorus is very good for bloom development, and potassium is helpful for roots to develop. They're all very helpful. When using them in containers, I would choose a very balanced formula and nothing higher than 15. Get higher than that, it's just unnecessary. And those fertilizers will just leach out and you're not going to actually get benefit out of them anyway. So use a lower number and keep them as balanced as possible. A 10, 10, 10, a 12, 12, 12 is good. Even as low as 8 is fine. And you know, you can always tell, like if you find something that says bloom boost, that's going to have a really high middle number. And that's pretty common. You'll see those. And maybe you've used them. This is a liquid formula. So it's typically added, there's directions on how to do it, typically added to your watering can when you're doing some watering. This is something that's going to take effect very immediately in your soil. So I don't recommend using like a liquid or water soluble, which kind of comes in a box. And the water soluble comes in, looks like a little powder that you mix with water. Both the liquid and the water soluble can be added later after your plants are kind of established in there. And then those plants are going to take those fertilizers up right away. I do recommend using, and you can mix it into your soil or just sprinkle on the top after you put your plants in there, a slow release or a timed release. And they look like little pellets. Again, there's directions on the back. It usually comes with a nice scoop. It doesn't need very many. And as those plants grow and you water the containers, then you end up, these little pellets break open and the fertilizer becomes available for the plant to take up. These can be added at planting time. And I recommend that because you could do another dosing like mid-season if you wanted, but it takes a while for these little pellets to bust open and make that fertilizer available. So if you add some now when you're planting, then you know it's there and it's available. This is the type of stuff that you're going to find in your bag mixes that have fertilizer in it. It's that slow release pellets. So if you see little pellets in there and you think it's not perlite, it's not vermiculite, it's likely a little pelletized fertilizer. Oh, and the other thing, I talked about fertilizer kind of leaching out. And if you've grown things, particularly in terracotta pots, and ever had like white marks that maybe get on your deck or the side of your container, remember that fertilizers are in essence a salt. And when you start to see that, it should kind of trigger you to think that you may be fertilizing too much, because those white marks that typically can stain the sides of your pot or even your deck area or whatever kind of material you have, like maybe they're pavers or something in your back or front yard where your containers are. That's just salts leaching out as you water. So if you start to see that, you might say, whoa, I need to back down on fertilizing, because it's showing me that that fertilizer is basically just coming out of the container. So not everybody, people are always like, why do I get those white spots? And basically it's fertilizer. Not always the case, but if you see that, that can be very indicative of where it's got a little extra fertilizer and it's just coming out of the soil profile, so I don't really need it. So now we're just kind of wasting the material and time and effort to add fertilizer. I'm willing to take questions if we have any.
Sure, and we do have some questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. All right. Well, thank you very much. And I love the demonstration. The fact that your hands are dirty just makes this all better.
I'm kind of making a mess in here. It's going to take me a while to clean up, but it's okay.
It's literally your job.
It's for education.
That's right. Okay. So one of the questions. So when you took the plastic part off of the bottom of the plastic pot, is it possible, like if you put it back on but don't have the holes aligned, so it's just kind of sitting on it, can you use that as a bottom waterer?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly. I would recommend not doing that at first because your plant's roots aren't going to reach that far down. So you're going to end up just having a whole bunch of water sitting there. But yes, as your pot continues to grow and your plants are getting kind of snug in there, there's nothing wrong with adding some water for it to sit in. Don't let that water sit though in there for longer than a couple days. So if you have water that's sitting in there and it, maybe it's rained, like we had that crazy rain last night, and it's just sitting there and it's not drying out, you want to go out and dump that because the more water that sits in there, the more problems that can arise. But I see what you're saying, like maybe do kind of a little offset so it's not tucked in there. Yeah, it's an option for sure. A lot of people tell me too that they sometimes turn this over and has used this as a base and kind of put it on sideways. Maybe you have two of them and you kind of do that, and that also then gives some airflow to the bottom, so you don't end up with having concern for water clogging in there.
Okay. Yeah, and somebody also asked, did the plastic bottoms add to mosquito problems?
I mean, they can if you let them sit out and put water in them. That's another reason to be out and monitoring that space. Mosquitoes only take a couple of days to lay eggs, and we got the little critters ready. So yeah, it happens very quickly. So like I said, these make for great, like if you want to use them in your garden to just hold water, or if you want to use them to hold water, as an offset in here, that's totally an option. But another reason to be dumping that water every couple of days because it doesn't take very long for those mosquitoes to find a water source, and it can be this small, it can be just a couple inches deep, and you'll have mosquitoes.
Okay. Someone asks, do you ever recommend using the water holding crystals in your potting mix?
I don't. I one year even tried it because a lot of people were asking. I think it was fairly new then or something. And I just didn't see a difference. I don't know that it's, for me, I feel like it's just another thing to put in there to hope that it does what it's supposed to do. In the end, I just prefer to just water. So for me, I don't really recommend it. I don't think it's a hindrance, but I just don't think it's necessary.
Okay. Now you kind of already answered this one when you potted the plants, but should you ever get rid of the soil that comes with a pre-potted plant? Like if you're transferring?
Not usually. I mean, like I said, I typically just depends on how root bound that plant is. Sometimes it comes off pretty easily because there's not much soil left in there. It's mostly roots. But I mean, honestly, if you're buying your plants from a trusted source and it doesn't look suspect to you, I would just keep it in there. There's no harm in moving that soil into that container because typically it's not a lot of soil.
Okay, thank you. Someone asks, can you put a stone or small rock in the bottom to partially cover the drain hole so the soil doesn't come out?
I get this question a lot, and honestly, if any soil comes out, it's going to be a minuscule amount. So yes, the answer is yes, you can. But I would say it's really not necessary. A lot of people are concerned about this, and I worked with someone who was adamant that there should be a layer of gravel at the bottom. And in essence, you're just taking away from that soil profile again. So you're taking away from space where the roots could be growing rather than giving them more space to spread out. So I wouldn't worry too much, because if you started correctly, your clay pot, your terracotta pot has pores sealed with water, and you've started with moist soil, the chances of extra soil falling out the bottom are pretty minuscule. It's not something I would worry about, a bunch of soil coming out the bottom.
All right. Someone else asks, what is the plant ratio to the diameter of the pot?
That's a tricky one, because mostly it has more to do with the space that the roots need. So when I look at the containers, I tend to not overfill them, because I want those plants to have space to grow. This was the 8-inch pot, right? Did I do that right? Yeah, 8-inch pot. And I put a 6-inch Gumfreena in here. And for me, that's really all the space that I would get. Now, I mentioned that there are a slew of programs where I've talked about how to grow vegetables in containers, herbs in containers, companion planting in containers. And there are some guidelines for those types of things. Like, for example, if you're a vegetable grower and you're growing tomatoes, you need a 10-gallon bucket, because those plants are going to get very big and the roots need just as much space to grow. So you need larger containers for some of those larger types of vegetables, for example. But in terms of the diameter of the pot, if you want to use and do a really cool design, like typical design principles, right? You want to have something that kind of is the striking centerpiece, maybe something that fills in, and then things that maybe cover that pot and drape over the side. So you want to put like 5 or 7 plants in your pot. I think you should invest in a 14 or 18-inch pot. So you're going to want a pretty big pot for that. So just kind of as a starting point, in order to answer that question without having too many specifics.
Okay. Someone asks, can we grow native plants in containers?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Native plants typically, depending on what they are, even our perennials, are going to have deeper root systems. So you're probably going to need bigger pots. The other thing with our native plants is they are perennial plants. So much like when we grow herbs in containers, a lot of times those herbs can stay in those containers year round. You can just maybe slide them over or move them into a cool spot and not necessarily a frozen spot, but they would be treated just like if you were going to grow perennials and plants, which you can totally do. So you can carry them over from year to year, or you can repot and move them. The biggest thing when you grow native plants in pots is to make sure you have a big enough pot. So you're going to want to invest in some larger pots if you're going to grow native plants, because again, the benefit to growing native plants is that they tend to have a more robust and larger root system, which is why they grow so easily here.
Do you ever reuse soil from last year as part of the soil mix?
All right, here's what I suggest. If you find that you have issues, bugs, diseases, stuff's happening to your plants over the course of the year, the soil that's in that container needs to be discarded. And depending on what you find, you could compost it if you have a compost. Some people will say, well, I've just kept the soil and I pulled out my plants because I grew annuals or whatever, and now I just want to reuse and plant in this soil. I don't recommend it. And remember when I said, you find that bagged mix and you open it and there's some funky stuff in there? Funky stuff could be in here. So if you want to give those plants the best chance, start fresh. Or at the end of the season this fall, when you're taking these things apart, take the plants out and put that soil in one of these plastic tote containers and store it that way. And then next year, when you bust it open, you can take a look at it and see if it smells funky or looks weird, or, I know that all my plants were healthy. And so now I can maybe refresh it, add a little bit more coconut coir, and then reuse it that way. But I don't recommend letting soil sit in this container and then reusing it again. Not to say that you wouldn't have success with that, but if you really want your plants to be healthy and do well and have a nice home to live in, I recommend starting fresh or making sure you've saved last year's soil in an appropriate way, not just in your pots over the winter.
All right. Someone asked, do you recommend removing the blooms on plants before planting to encourage root growth?
Not necessarily. Here's the thing with things that grow in containers. They're just plants like all the rest of the plants. And I really think if you give them enough space in that soil profile, so if you choose an appropriate size pot, I think they're going to do what they do. So, I like fertilizers. I think they have a place, but I have to say, and this is, Cindy's soapbox, people will try to tell you that your plant needs to be fed. But we should know that plants make their own food from sunlight. They use the sunlight energy, right? Carbon dioxide, they photosynthesize. They don't necessarily need fertilizer. So they also don't necessarily need for us to manipulate them into focusing their energy in another way. If those blooms are spent or they're on their way out, absolutely. That's one of the things we do when we maintain our containers, which is another program, right? But in an effort to make sure that those roots have a good start and they're focusing their energy there, I don't see that it's really worth the effort of doing that when you're first setting your containers out, if that makes sense.
Okay. Someone asks, if we have purchased plants, how can we best keep until mid-month?
I think if you've got them, you want to treat them as just as if they were in your container, right? So depending on if you purchased a whole flat of them or if you've got just a few smaller pots, I'd start sticking them in the location where you're going to put that container. It's a great way to start to acclimate them. So let's say you're going to put some containers together and it's going to be on your back deck, and your back deck might be a little bit more sunny than where your plants are next to your garage, right? This is a good time to stick them in those locations so they can kind of get acclimated to that spot, because if that's where they're going to be living for the next however many months, then they're going to be less shocked when you plant them in a bigger pot and move them out there. So I would recommend just sticking them where you think they're going to end up, and make sure to keep them watered. It's hard because I know, like, I try to buy stuff because you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited and there's a sale and I want to get all these plants, and I end up sometimes buying stuff that I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with, right? Like I'm thinking other people have this thought where they're just like, oh my gosh, I have all these plants and I just thought they were cool. Now I don't know what to do with them. And then they end up in those little containers for far too long. And that's when sometimes if you don't have time to repot, just make sure you're sticking them somewhere that's cool so they're less likely to need more water. Because I think the thing that happens to me a lot is they end up drying out because I haven't really gotten to them to water them. Because if they're in their tiny little plug or small pot that you bought them in, they're going to be watered more frequently than when you stick them into a bigger pot.
Someone asks, could you say the name of the plant that you demonstrated with once more?
Yeah, let me show you the tag. It's called Gumfreena, and we grow it. It's called globe amaranth, people call it. Here's a cool picture of it. It's truffle pink. Megan, our horticulture, is going to put this, I think, in one of our seasonal beds. So I stole it from the greenhouse, had to put it back. But it has, we grow one in the cutting garden that's called Strawberry Fields. And it is wonderful for cut flowers, and also is a great pollinator, attracted butterflies and hummingbirds love it. So it's got a cool pink flower. Look like little balls of pink.
All right. Someone else asks, would inoculating the container with beneficial fungus help the plant grow better?
It depends what you're growing. But I mean, here's the other thing is, like, this is a real general course on container setup, but let's say you're growing something that's really specific, and you know that you've had trouble growing it because maybe it is, last year you grew it and it was more prone and we got some funky diseases in it, right? Then maybe, but quite honestly, unless you're growing something really specialized, I mean, all the things I mentioned, herbs, other perennials, annual flowering plants, things like vegetables, I don't think any of those things really require that special step of inoculating. I wouldn't say it's a hindrance, and I feel like I've been saying this a lot, like these aren't things that are going to necessarily cause problems for you, but I feel like it's just not a necessary step to take.
All right. Someone asks, they say, I would like to plant an aloe vera plant in my house in a tin can. How should I drain it?
Oh, you're going to want to use what interior scape designers have used for years. So if you like that tin can, use it as what we call a cover pot. So if I were to grow something, and I really liked this container, then I would grow it in a smaller container that has drainage holes and stick it inside. That way you can, and if you wanted to, you could elevate this container. This one has holes, so picture it doesn't, because it's your tin can. So you want to put something in here to like elevate it, that's fine too. But again, this is going to hold water, that tin can, so make sure you're emptying it pretty regularly. But plant it in something smaller that has drainage holes and then stick it into your tin can. I think that's the easiest fixed.
All right. Someone asks, any special tips for growing vegetables in pots?
Yeah, I mean, most vegetables, I've grown a lot of tomatoes, and I've also grown a lot of squashes and things that kind of run all over in containers. And I think the biggest tip is most of the vegetables that you're going to grow tend to need more space than you think they will. So like I mentioned, if you're growing tomatoes, you're going to need like a big bucket to grow them in so that those roots have space to grow. But for example, if you're growing, let's say this is a perfect bowl for like lettuces. So say you're growing some greens, you want to try to grow not necessarily spinach, but things like different types of lettuces. This is a great little container because most of our lettuces they don't have very deep roots and it's easy to move around. Sometimes you can use it even as a centerpiece. So things like greens and like things like leafy stuff would benefit from a more shallow container. But some of those that, vegetables that you're going to grow and that really like the heat of the summer, they're going to need sunlight and they're going to need a bigger container than you might imagine. I have information about that too. I've done programs on that. So you can always reach out to Inniswood and I can help you with that.
All right. Somebody said, I have heard about using coffee filters to cover drainage holes.
Yeah, that's been around for a long time. I would liken it to that layer of gravel or the question we got about maybe putting some rocks in the bottom of your container. I just don't think it's necessary. If it makes you feel better because you really are interested, you don't want that extra soil to come out. Again, it's not going to hinder it. It is probably the only thing I would say would be okay to put in there besides soil. So, because I'm pretty hardcore, like just give the plant soil to grow in. But if you just want that tiny thin layer to cover those holes, because you're maybe worried about where you're putting that container, you don't want stuff to come out the bottom, or at least in large quantities at once. I think it's fine. But again, like I've been saying, I don't think it's a necessary step.
All right. And then the last question, should I keep purchased hanging baskets in the garage for a few more days?
Yes and no. It's cold, man. Like it's colder than I thought it would be. This is like supposed to be really warm weather. It's not freezing temperatures anymore. So depending what's growing in there, you probably have some annuals. I think definitely at night, you want to make sure they're inside until we start getting into warmer temps. But I don't think you're going to see any damage on them if you were to put them out. So yeah, you might want to, from what I've seen in the next week, we're going to get back up into the 70s during the day. So I think very soon, if you want to hold on for a couple days to protect them, that's fine. But I do feel like the middle of next week is going to be fine and you're going to be able to put all that stuff out.
Okay. Oh, I lied. One more. So how do we clean pots from last season?
Oh, good question. I didn't talk about this. So the best thing to do is to just use a bleach solution. So when you're done with your pots this season, scrub them, soak them in a bleach solution. So just like if you were to clean your tub and your shower, so you don't need a whole lot of bleach, but soak them and then let them air dry if you can. So if you've got like a nice sunny day and you have a space outside, stick them outside to dry in the air, then make sure they're dry and then store them. So that works the best. And like I've been growing plants for lots of years and managed greenhouses, and that is always how we've cleaned our pots. So we scrub them as much as we can, get the junk off, clean them if you want to with like a Dawn soap or something, and then dip them and soak them into some bleach solution, and that'll help kill any like junk that might be hanging out on there. But the important thing is before you store them, make sure they're completely dry. So, and the best way to dry them is to find a nice sunny, windy day, stick them outside and then store them. So good old bleach. That's what we use.
All right. Well, Cindy, thank you so much. Wonderful job. This is all very helpful because I've got pots and plants waiting. All right. So again, everyone, we will be offering the recording of this video as well as the transcript. But yes, Cindy, very good job. Thank you very much. And
Oh, it was a
everyone,
pleasure.
thank you for coming.
All right, thanks everybody. Come see us at Inniswood.
Bye. Oh, and Cindy, make sure to email me about that Wi-Fi thing.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I love that idea because there's so many. I mean, like I said, I've done a bunch of these programs just based on different plants. So maybe we could host that, via you. We could talk about that. That would be awesome.
Absolutely. We've got the tech. Let's use it.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right. Bye. Thank you.
See ya.